I'm Christine Vigars, sorry, and I'm a resident of Kensington and Chelsea, but the professional address is the Healthwatch offices, 85 Barlby Road, West 10, and I'm chair of Healthwatch Central West London, which covers the three boroughs of Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea, and Hammersmith and Fulham.
Now, in front of you, you should see your submission.
Yeah.
Can you confirm it's true to the best of your knowledge and understanding, and you wish it to stand as your evidence to the Commission?
Yes.
I wanted to ask first a little bit about the role of Healthwatch, which, as I understand it, has a statutory function.
Yeah.
By whom is it funded?
It's funded by the local authority from money which comes through as part of the Department of Health grant.
And when you say the local authority, in your case, do you mean the three local authorities?
The three local authorities, yes.
Is part of your function to offer challenge to proposals that are put forward?
Yes. We are there, we see ourselves as a critical friend.
So when you begin by saying that Healthwatch supports the principles underlying shaping a healthier future, do I take it from that the challenges that you offer are to the manner in which the programme is being implemented rather than to the existence of the programme itself?
Yes.
And does that circumscribe your remit at all and your independence?
I don't think so. I mean, our job is, our main concern is around the communication and engagement, or lack of it, that there's been on this programme. And we have been involved all the way along. We've been involved as part of the Patient and Public Reference Group, first when we were part of Link, and then more recently as Healthwatch. So we have had sight of all the proposals as they come forward, but we feel that the process of engagement with the public has been very lacking.
I'm going to come to that. What I wanted to ask you about first is this. Given that shaping a healthier future, it isn't actually a body or an organisation itself, is it? So to whom do you report?
In what sense?
In the sense of your findings about matters, in the sense of if you have something which is not going correctly or you wish something to be done in a different way, to whom do you take those concerns?
We take them to the overview and scrutiny committees in the three boroughs, and we can escalate any concerns we have to Healthwatch England and to the Care Quality Commission.
Do you have any direct links and working relationships with the CCGs?
We work collaboratively with the CCGs. We have membership on the Quality, Safety and Patient Risk Committees of Hammersmith and Fulham and Kensington and Chelsea.
And who decides what work you undertake?
We decide that we have a specification, obviously, because we're funded by, on contract by the council, but within that we work out a work programme every year.
I wondered if I could just ask about something. It's at page 744 of your submission. One of the things that you say is, it's paragraph 8.2, you're just talking about St Mary's, and you say, will SAF also give assurances that X, Y and Z is the case? And what I wanted to ask you is, if SAF isn't a body and it doesn't exist, how is it that you say that SAF can give assurances? I was just curious about that.
Well, it's being managed by North West London.
So
yeah, I mean,
from whom should the assurance come, I suppose, is the question I'm asking.
I mean, actually, I think on that one, the assurance has to come from Imperial, because it's their estate and it's their hospital.
So in fact, SAF can't give assurances because SAF doesn't exist as an entity, is that
well,
right?
it doesn't actually have control of the budget and the estate.
Now, you're also talking very briefly about the input that you have in various bodies, and you mentioned, I think, that you have input into patient representation groups, the transport groups, and on the NHS North West London outline business case working group. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think it's on. So if you want to have a look at it, it's page 739, which is where you set this out. And it's a paragraph, I think, 1.3. Yeah. And what you say there, you're just listing the bodies that you've got involvement with. And what I wanted to ask you about, in terms of the outline business case, if you're on that working group, can you throw any light on why it hasn't been provided yet?
No, is the answer to that.
Any discussions about it? Any hints? Anything that might assist the Commission? Or a complete sort of blank on that?
That's not something I sit on myself, and I'm afraid I really can't answer that one.
Now,
I wonder if you could be very kind and just keep your voice up.
Sorry.
It's very difficult. Thank you.
But as a body involved in a scrutiny function, effectively, would you expect to have seen the business case? Would you expect to have more information than you do have?
We would expect to see it in due course, but I can't say exactly when.
Would you wish to be able to see it?
Yes, we would wish to be able to see it.
Now, I want to ask you about the consultation process. Now, you raise some difficulties with that.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, in your view, did the consultation reach everyone it should have done?
You mean the initial consultation?
The initial consultation, yes.
I mean, you're never going to reach everybody. It was quite widespread in terms of the leaflet drop. I think the main issue was that it was limited in the extent of what was being consulted on. I mean, it was mainly about which should be the major hospitals. It didn't really ask the prior question about, is this a sensible way to go forward? And it didn't go at all into what would happen once that decision had been made.
Do you think it should have been more open in the ambit of what was being asked?
I think it would have been helpful if it had been, but I think the main point is that going forward from that, there needs to be an ongoing process, and that is what I think we feel hasn't really been happening.
Can you expand on that a little bit more and explain what you think is lacking?
Well, when the proposals went to the independent review panel, they said that there needed to be a shift in emphasis from telling people what was going to happen to an active engagement with the community in order to co-design the services. And that is the shift that we would like to see happening. Because a lot of what's been happening has really been about telling people, although it's been very confused. But there hasn't been a sort of ongoing process of consulting with the community. And there's been very confused messages coming out about what's going to happen.
And is that something that you as a body have tried to raise?
Yes.
And what response have you been met with?
Well, we've raised it in a number of ways. I mean, we as a body have been running, we've been running an out-of-hospital group which has met 10 times over the last year or so and has been looking at these proposals, the out-of-hospital proposals, in some detail. We've also held 2 larger meetings which have been attended by about 40 or 50 people, one addressed by Imperial and one addressed by the CCG. So that was an opportunity for the public to actually ask their questions. But it isn't, what's needed is a much more joined up approach, because at the moment the consultation is being run partly by the CCG, partly by Imperial, partly by the SAF team, and to an extent there's an interest from the council as well, so that all those bodies have an interest in consultation, and there isn't any attempt to bring that all together.
So, bearing that in mind, overall, are you satisfied that that has been a fair process?
No, I'm not. I mean, I think that it's been very slow getting off the ground, and I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be happening. In some ways, some of that is beginning to happen. I mean, there is some progress being made with Imperial around their consultation plans, and also with Hammersmith and Fulham CCG. We've had constructive conversations with both of those. But there needs to be much more outreach to the black and minority ethnic communities, much more consideration of how you produce materials for people with learning disabilities, and in community languages. I mean, all of these things really weren't integrated as well as they could have been into the consultation around the closure of Hammersmith Hospital A&E.
So if the consultation process hasn't been a fair one, how does that sit with your support for the principle of these reconfigurations?
When we say we support the principle, and what we are supportive of, I mean, we have had a lot of conversations with clinicians who have put the clinical case for this, and they are quite clear that we will get better services if we have more specialised centres and better out-of-hospital services. I mean, we know that our emergency admissions over the 3 boroughs are very high. I have a background in working in older people's services. I have a background with Age UK. I know that hospitals are not the best place for older people, and they would be much better served by better services, community services. So those are the principles that we're supporting.
I wanted to ask you about the out-of-hospital strategy. You know, at page 740 of your submission, what you say is that as a body you are not clear about what's happened to services which have moved out of hospitals over the last 2 years. I wondered if you could give an example of this.
Well, at the moment, the out-of-hospital services, the movement of out-of-hospital services under health systems is in its very early stages. I mean, we're not looking at large numbers. But for instance, the work that was done around the virtual ward in Hammersmith and Fulham was very good, we are told, but there hasn't been the time to evaluate that before we move forwards. And at the moment, the Community Independence Service, which is coming in across the 3 boroughs, is just at the point of being rolled out. So it's a question, I think, of timing. It seems to us, I mean, we always argued from the beginning that the out-of-hospital services had to be in place before there was a loss of any hospital beds, and that, as a principle, was accepted. However, there hasn't yet been time to see whether these out-of-hospital services are really operating effectively before we begin to pull back on the number of beds on offer.
So what needs to be put in place?
Well,
how long will it take to assess whether those services are actually delivering what they say they're going to do?
Well, you need an evaluation programme which looks both at the metrics but also at patient experience.
And as to your knowledge, is there one of those in place?
There will be. I mean, there are plans to get that in place, but it hasn't happened yet. So it's a question of timing.
So is there a danger of the timing becoming dislocated and the services being rolled out before the evidence base for them is in place?
That's our worry.
Now, I wanted to ask you about GP services as well. Are you able to comment on the readiness of GP services, GP practices, for the extended role which is envisaged for them?
I think it's very varied. We have feedback from our members, not surprisingly, about the difficulty in getting GP appointments. So obviously GPs are extremely under pressure, as the lady was saying earlier. However, some GPs have been very involved in the development of the health system's work and are very committed to it. And the one that I know best, which is West London CCG, there has been a sign-up of about half the practices to take on the extra role of providing out-of-hospital care for older people, and taking which will change their workload. It's also a question of funding, and I don't really understand the GP funding, but it is a question of how the money is actually shifted so that they are reimbursed properly for the time that they give to these extra or different duties.
So I presume on that basis you're unable to help with whether or not those GPs who have signed up actually have the resources.
That's a question I can't answer.
I wanted to ask you about another service which is supposed to underpin the out-of-hospital strategy. This is the 111 service. I'm not quite sure how much engagement your body has had with that, but if you have, can you tell us how it's working as far as you know?
We haven't had much engagement. I mean, what we did do last year was a piece of work in which we served in Hammersmith and Fulham, in which we surveyed about 140 residents and had focus groups which covered another 80 residents. And this was asking about their understanding about 111 and urgent care centres and the services on offer. About half the people we surveyed didn't know anything about the 111 service. 60% of them didn't know what an urgent care centre was.
Now, bearing in mind that's quite a small snapshot,
Sure.
What do you draw from that?
Well, it is a small snapshot, but it sort of resonates with what we hear from other people. And I think that there's an urgent piece of public education or patient education that needs to happen about what an urgent care centre is and what the 111 service is. On the urgent care centre, there was then a leaflet that went round to everybody, not everybody, but everybody in the Hammersmith area. And that really wasn't very clear. I mean, people found it very unclear, because it said things like you take a minor injury to an urgent care centre, and nobody knew what a minor injury was, and it wasn't clear whether you also took children or whether it was just for adults. So, and there were gaps in it. There were things that weren't mentioned. The Parsons Green Walk-in Centre wasn't mentioned. So that piece of information wasn't clear, and there is a need for much more clear, focused information.
Bearing in mind that you were aware of that lack, what did your body do to take that back to the people who needed to know that information?
Well, we took that one back to the CCG, but I mean, unfortunately, that particular leaflet wasn't shared with the patient reference group in advance. But I mean, I think that it's difficult for people to move out of NHS speak and to think about what this actually is going to look like and mean to patients.
And what do you say, what does your body say about co-location of urgent care centres with A&Es? What's your view on that?
I mean, I think it's largely a clinical question. And
well, perhaps if we look at it from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah.
What do the people with whom you've been consulting, and I mean by this I mean the local population, what do they say to you? What do they understand about the possibility that there may be an urgent care centre which doesn't have an A&E at the same site?
I think the particular worry that has been raised with us has been around children. And there seem to be rather mixed messages about that at Hammersmith Urgent Care Centre.
From whom? Coming from whom?
Coming from the people who are attending our groups, the public. I mean, the questions are coming from them, and the mixed messages are coming from the responses. I mean, at the Hammersmith Urgent Care Centre deals with children. However, when at one of our groups, when this question was asked to a consultant from St Mary's, he said, if you have a sick child, always take it to A&E. So, there are two different messages here.
And what do you say the impact of those mixed messages, those two different messages?
Well, I think it's very
likely to
worrying.
be?
And it's worrying for the individuals, but it's also worrying in terms of safety, because people with a sick child don't call an ambulance, they put the child in the car and take it to wherever.
And given these are concerns that I think your document dates from last year, in fact, the main body of the document, given these were concerns that you were raising then, have things changed? Have you had any positive changes noted, or are they still the same?
I think some things have changed. I mean, I think we are developing, as from Healthwatch, a much better relationship with Imperial. And I think that Imperial are beginning to put in place a program of consultation in which they will actually get the consultants, the clinicians, out into the community to talk with people.
Are you able to give us a little more detail about that?
Well, they're going to look at what we said to Imperial was that they needed to think about pathways, because that's what worries people. I mean, if you have experience of someone who has had a stroke, or you are the parent of a child, or you're contemplating having an knee operation, you need to know actually how that care is going to be delivered and where. And so we said to Imperial that what you need to do is to actually come out and talk people through what is actually going to happen and where the care is going to be delivered. Because there's been another issue has been the uncertainty about what was going to happen to elective surgery, because originally it was said that was going to go to Charing Cross, and then the Imperial clinical strategy made it quite clear that elective surgery was going to go to Central Middlesex. But we've had no answers really to the questions about, well, what is the impact of that on transport and on the pathway, because with orthopaedic surgery we're told the most important thing, and it's obvious, is that the operation is successful. The second most important thing is that you get rehabilitative services. So that's what matters to people.
So two questions in one. Does it concern you, one, that you haven't had the answers about that, and two, does it concern you that it's only now that Imperial are sorting out a consultation of the sort which I must say one would have thought was rather more obvious? So what concerns do you have about that, if any?
Yes, I think it's late, and I think our experience is that very often consultation is something that's left to the last moment. People don't think about it at the beginning, and you need to think about it right the way through.
And what's the implication of leaving the public behind in terms of information?
Very poor, because particularly in Hammersmith and Fulham, there are many people who have a deep loyalty to Charing Cross Hospital, are committed to it and want to see it continuing. And it seems to us, I mean, many of these people are our members, and it seems to us that this is a passion that could be utilised positively and constructively. But if it isn't, you risk getting into a much more confrontational situation.
Now, I wanted to ask you about the impact of the A&E closures which have already taken place. Now, you asked for assurances about the ability of St Mary's and Chelsea and Westminster to cope. Have you had those assurances?
Yes, I mean, they say that they can cope. We raised this at scrutiny. St Mary's have recently employed 6 extra A&E consultants. However, I mean, I suppose that's on the positive side. On the worrying side, the recent CQC inspection of St Mary's the original inspection report was extremely critical of the A&E service there. The revisit said it was now satisfactory, but it's worrying that a major hospital should allow its A&E to get into the state when it was failed by a CQC inspection.
And we know there were difficulties in waiting times and meeting the 4-hour target. Do you have any information on a very up-to-date basis about whether coming into the spring from the winter there's been any particular change in those meeting those targets or not?
Yes, well, as you know, the waiting times were very bad over the winter period. They're now beginning to come back a bit. They're still not really up to where they should be.
Do you know whether they're still above the sort of national average or below the national average?
I couldn't tell you. I don't have that to hand. But
just moving on to think about the hyperacute stroke unit, which is moving to St Mary's. Do you have a view, does your body have a view about having two hyperacute stroke units very close to one another? Because of course the other is at UCH.
At UCH, yeah.
And on the impact on the population, the wider population of the region. I wonder if you can help with that.
Yeah, well, that's something that we raised, because it seemed that it was something that needed to be looked at not just on a North West London basis, but at a cross London basis, both in terms of where people are likely to come from and what the patient choice was on that.
And what does your body say about that? Is it, I mean, broadly speaking, is it a decision you support, or is it one where you say that the HASI should remain where it is?
I think, well, the whole thing is interconnected. Again, there is a clinical case for having the hyperacute stroke unit and the trauma unit in the same place. However, we did have assurances that the hyperacute stroke unit wouldn't move until the St Mary's redevelopment had been done. And, you know, that one doesn't know when that's going to happen.
So is there quite a substantial degree of uncertainty about that?
A great deal of uncertainty about it.
And what impact does that have upon the people, the people in the locality? The uncertainty rather than the actual changes?
Well, it's all part of not taking the public with us, you know, because if there's uncertainty about that, and uncertainty about elective surgery, and uncertainty about what's actually going to go onto the Charing Cross site, people get frustrated, and therefore if they're frustrated, they get angry.
I just wanted to ask you a little bit about transport. Not blue light transport, but other transport. Are you able to help with what liaison has gone on between the CCGs, the trusts and Transport for London? And if so, what the state of play is?
I can't help you with the state of play. There is the Transport Advisory Group, which has been looking at that and has been in conversation with Transport for London.
Do you know if those conversations have actually produced anything?
I think not, but again I'd have to check that one.
And is that something that if it continues to be the case, then presumably the Transport Advisory Group needs to tell somebody that is the case? Again, to whom would they report, and what should be done with that information?
Well, another avenue, I suppose, is to the Mayor, if we're talking about transport.
And do you regard transport as critical to
Absolutely
the success of
critical.
this? So if the transport links aren't in place between the various hospitals and the out-of-hospital provision, if the reforms are done in isolation, if you like, without that element being in place, what's the impact?
I think it can have a terrible impact, particularly on Hammersmith, because, well, I mean, on all the North West London outer boroughs as well, but in our patch on Hammersmith, because that's where the transport links aren't good at the moment, otherwise they're quite good. But the other part to put into that is hospital transport,
Yes.
which is very poor. And that is an issue that through our Enter and View work, our Dignity Champions work, we have raised consistently with Imperial. And actually, people who need hospital transport can wait for hours for it.
And you've raised it consistently with Imperial. Are you able to say whether your raising of it has, again, produced any positive results?
Well, they are looking at the contract. It's out to contract, so they are looking at it.
But it's at that stage, again, there's still a degree of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Just bearing in mind all that you've said, at the outset of your submissions, what you say is that you recommend that no further progress is made until the issues and questions that you've raised have been resolved. Does that remain your position today?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that there's in some ways there are some things that have gone so far that it's dangerous not to continue with them. Some of these issues have to be resolved and have to be resolved quickly, and the out-of-hospital services have to be in place before we lose the beds. Yes, that is our position, with I suppose a slight reservation about if the thing's gone so far that it's not safe to stop it, are you better to go on with it? But that's not a judgment I can make.
Thank you. If you'd like to wait there may be some questions from the commissioners.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm concerned to know from you, it's in a sense the role of Healthwatch and who exactly you're representing. So I've got two questions that relate to that. First is this. To what extent does Healthwatch present the public with a balanced picture of proposals such as the plans that we've been talking about? In other words, provide the public with pros and cons relating to, for an example, the closure of an A&E. Now, do you present the various aspects and sides of that argument? Secondly, where the public display opposition to a closure, do you represent that opposition or objection? And the reason I ask that is that in the documents we've been provided with, I don't see any reference to opposition. A lot of reservations, a lot of questions, but no principled opposition seems to be reflected here. So that's the reason for these questions. I wonder if you could answer them.
Yes. If I can take the second one first. We have a role in representing our members, and we have 6,000 members across the 3 boroughs. So it's they're not going to have a uniform view. And among those members are a whole range of different groups as well as individuals. So we will canvass views from our members and we will put those forward. It very often is that there will be diverse views and we will put them both forward.
Yes, I understand that, but we don't see here, I don't see here. Both. We only see one view, which is support for the programme with reservations. And you've spelt them out here. Questions that have to be answered. Don't close certain services before you put others in place. All sorts of obvious questions. But I don't see any critique of first, because we've heard witnesses who say we're opposed to these plans.
Yeah.
So if that's right, they must be out there amongst your 6,000. If they are, why aren't they reflected in your report?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we take a view on what we hear and on the balance of, all that's coming in. And remember, we've got 3 boroughs to think about. And we then take a view and we reach a position. I mean, this statement that you have was discussed in all 3 boroughs by the local committees, and there are about 16 people on each of those local boards, and it was thrashed around and amended and so forth and so on. So it's not something that I and the chief executive sit down and think about and think, what should we do? It has been very thoroughly discussed, and this is what we came up with.
I wonder if I could just run up. I mean, I have in front of me the structure of the NHS in England, and I see there's a column which Healthwatch England appears along with Care Quality Commission and Monitor Trust Development Authority, which is to monitoring and regulation. And I'm just thinking, the Care Quality Commission judges practices, for example, and other organisations on something they call the key lines of inquiry, which are safety, effectiveness, caring, are the well-led and relevant.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just wondering if you were to apply those key lines of inquiry to the whole project, whether you would have to say it was, I'm a CQC advisor, I ought to know this off my heart, whether you say whether it's outstanding, is it good, does it need improvement, or is it failing? Where would you put it?
We're very familiar with them because we do a lot of inter-reviews, and we are assessing establishments and services on those lines. I'm not certain you can apply it to the whole project. You could certainly apply it to bits of it. And if we do an inter-review, for example, to maternity services after they've moved from Ealing, we will do exactly that.
Yes, well, if they move, it's a bit late, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
If you find that they were caring, which I've got every reason to believe they are, they're well led, which certainly they are, they're relevant, we've heard that, they're effective, and I think they're safe. And anyway, I'm going off down a hot course of mine. Can I just develop again a bit further? I don't understand where the locus of control is, to use jargon term, in respect of SAHM. I mean, earlier you were trying to explore that for us, but if you have your monitoring regulation hat on, to whom do you go to say, up with this, we shall not put?
I mean, that's very clear. We go locally to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee and nationally to the Care Quality Committee and to Healthwatch England.
I noticed the black line that goes up to the Department of Health.
Well, via Healthwatch England and the CQC.
So if you go to Healthwatch England and you say, I'm not saying you think this, but say you did think it, something terrible is going to happen. Will Healthwatch England go to the Department of Health and say, something terrible is going to happen?
Yeah, they would.
Is there a mechanism?
There's a mechanism for that. There's an escalation process, and there's the protocol that we have to fill in. We then escalate it. I was on the Healthwatch England committee for a year, so I know how it works at that end. Then that is all gathered together, and the key issues that have been escalated are brought to the committee, and they take a decision what they're going to do with them, and then they feed it back to the local health watch. So there's a process.
Perhaps jokingly, it came out from one witness last week that there is a kind of cult, almost like a cult thing. It's operating like a cult where people begin to believe in the project. I use the phrase cognitive dissonance, where people ignore evidence, and in fact, interestingly, I see you express dissatisfaction in part of your evidence that you would go to meetings where people weren't prepared, ready to give you answers. And except that they seem to believe in the project. And I notice also that you make some very trenchant objections under accessibility, effectiveness, reach, clarity, effectiveness again. And having regard to those concerns, I mean, is it possible for you to change minds, or will it ever be possible to change minds?
I think that Healthwatch is a young organisation, and that we are making quite a lot of progress in changing things, but it's a big ask to,
Well, I'm sorry to keep pushing. If you push this a little bit further, I appreciate that you're your organisation, you may have a political pull, etc., etc., but you are an observer and have an understanding of the system. Who has the power then to make people change their minds and face it?
Well, Department of Health, NHS England, and Department of Health.
NHS England. Okay. So if we were able to persuade the NHS England, you think that something might happen?
Yeah.
You have faith in that?
Well, faith in something.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you refer several times to the 6,000 members. So you regard Healthwatch, I mean the structure of Healthwatch is based on that membership, not on the views of the wider community around you. It's basically those members decide.
Both. And every Healthwatch is different. I mean, we are actually a membership organisation, and so we put a lot of work into recruiting and training and supporting our members, some of whom then take on roles within the quality monitoring process. But we also go out to the wider population, yes, and all our meetings are open. So when I say that we gather sort of 50 to a meeting, some of those will be members, but it could be anybody, public meetings.
But when it comes to shaping up your responses, it's the members that you go to, and then those who are on the various boards you refer to. Yes. Okay. I'm also curious. You do mention different Healthwatches are differently composed and work differently. I mean, is there any way in which you coordinate together? I mean, we had the Ealing Healthwatch last week, who obviously was putting things from a rather different point of view than you were.
Right.
I mean, do you have any coordination between you?
We do.
Any discussion?
We do. There's a regular meeting of the 8 North West London Healthwatches, and we are all members of the Public and Patient Reference Group for SAF, so we get the same information and we share it and we talk about it.
Well, I mean, it would appear you're rather more on the critical edge of things than the Ealing colleagues, who appear to be much less happy to criticise what was going on.
Every Healthwatch is different.
Just one completely unrelated question, but going back to earlier points. You say it's important worrying that 60% of people didn't know what an urgent care centre was, or what the difference was between that and an A&E. Do you think it's helpful or unhelpful for those promoting this process, including obviously politicians of a parliamentary and local level, to argue that in fact what's going to be replacing Charing Cross Hospital facilities at the moment is an A&E? I mean, they do actually argue it's an A&E, although clearly what they've actually got planned is an urgent care centre.
Exactly. I mean, this is an example of the doublespeak, which is exactly what I think is really worrying, because nobody knows what is going to happen at Charing Cross. What is it, an emergency centre, an A&E, or an urgent care centre?
Oh, you brought another one into play now, an emergency centre.
Well, that's what that's what the clinical strategy says it is. It's going to be an emergency centre.
That seems to be out of all the characteristics defined by Bruce Keogh in his analysis. So they're proposing something completely different?
No, I mean, I think they're proposing the same thing, but it's not just a question of terminology. I mean, it's what is actually going to be provided at Charing Cross. And local people rely on Charing Cross and are used to going there. So they need to know.
And if they listen, for example, to Jeremy Hunt saying there will be an accident emergency unit there, and they turn up and find it's an urgent care centre, isn't that potentially a dangerous error?
Yeah, absolutely.
So are you raising this for the politicians? It would help life for you and for local public if people said what's actually going on rather than using misleading terms.
Yeah, but I mean, at the moment we're all being told that we're waiting for the Kia review. We've been waiting it forever. So we're not getting very far with this one.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.